What is a healthy mind? Richie Davidson is on a mission to cultivate well-being as a skill and relieve suffering through a scientific understanding of the human mind. As a pioneering neuroscientist, a mindfulness and meditation teacher, a global public advocate and guide, he has been a proponent for healing, well-being, and social change, finding evidence that awareness, connection, insight, and purpose are the pillars of a healthy mind. And woven through it all is compassion.
Humans are born to be kind. They're born to love. It is part of our nature. And what I mean by that is actually something based on science. If we look at very young infants in the first 6 months of life, what we see is a preference for interactions that are loving, warm-hearted, compared to those that, for example, are selfish or aggressive. This is not a subtle preference. This is huge and robust. It shows that when we nurture these qualities, we're not nurturing something de novo, just out of nowhere, but rather we're actually nurturing a capacity that is part of the nature of who we are as human beings to begin with.
I'm Dr. Pam King, and you're listening to With and For, a podcast that explores the depths of psychological science and spiritual wisdom to offer practical guidance towards spiritual health, wholeness, and thriving on purpose. Perhaps one of the greatest influences on my spiritual health has been Dr. Richie Davidson, the founder and director of the Center for Healthy Minds at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he is also the William James and Villas Professor of Psychology and Psychiatry. Now, this might sound surprising, given that Richie is a practicing Buddhist and is a neuroscientist, and I am an ordained Presbyterian minister running the Thrive Center and a faculty member in the School of Psychology at Fuller Theological Seminary. But it's true. Richie's research has revolutionized the way we understand the brain and how plastic and malleable or changeable the brain is. Just like we train our physical bodies and go to the gym, he and his team at the Center for Healthy Minds have shown that we need to train our brains and work them out as well. As a result, he is changing the way we understand well-being. For Richie, well-being is a skill. It is something we do and practice. In other words, we are actually active agents of our own well-being. And this is why his work has so greatly impacted my own spiritual health. As a Christian, Richie's research has given me insight into how to modify my own traditional Christian practices to include rhythms of focus, attuning to my body, receptivity, reflection, and silence. His research has given me a whole new appreciation of Christian contemplative practices or disciplines. Although we can't control all that happens around us or to us, we do have some control on how we respond. He not only admonishes that we are active agents in our well-being, but offers helpful insight into what kind of practices make a difference for our minds in order to become more regulated or peaceful, more receptive or open, and even more trusting. Not just so that our personal well-being increases, but so that we become more engaged and thriving humans that contribute to a flourishing world. In this bountiful conversation with Richie Davidson, we discuss two kinds of learning, declarative and procedural, that need to be integrated in order to cultivate mental and spiritual health. The 4 pillars of a healthy mind, how to cultivate a mindset for healthy relational connection, how to understand the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves and how this impacts our well-being and spiritual health. We explore and respond to the overemphasis and even hype on mindfulness that seems to be present in our culture and what a healthy approach to meditation might be in our spiritual lives. Richie leads us through 2 real-time meditative practices to help integrate what we're learning with a practical way of being. And we close with an absolutely fascinating discussion of love and compassion. Richie, welcome to the podcast.
It's great to be here, Pam, and I'm really excited and honored to be part of this.
Thank you. I have to say that I hold you in such esteem and regard, and so many lives have been transformed through your research and resources that you have made. I'm just really honored to be able to speak to someone with such wisdom and the capacity to bring about change in human lives and therefore the world.
Well, that's especially meaningful to me coming from you. So thank you so much for the kind words.
Some of the things that we have in common are that we are both scientists, and you have had a pioneering and luminous career as a neuroscientist and psychologist. And we both have a lot of questions about things that I would call spirituality that may not be the word that you'd use. And your life has had such an unusual journey of science intersecting with spiritual traditions. So I'd love to invite you to share a bit how you came to this place and creating the Center for Healthy Minds.
Yeah, well, thank you for the invitation to be here and also to address this issue. It's a question that most scientists don't ask me, so I especially appreciate being asked the question directly. I've always considered spiritual experience to be part of the human repertoire. I think that humans are born to touch into those qualities that we come to label spiritual, because it is within our capacity to have experiences that in many ways we can say go beyond ourselves, connect us to something larger. And I've, been fortunate to taste some of those experiences myself in my personal life. And when I began as a scientist, I kept those experiences very much within privately, so to speak. And then I had the opportunity for the first time in 1992 to first meet the Dalai Lama. And at the time I met him, I was, doing my neuroscientific research, and I was focused on the question of why is it that some people are more vulnerable to life's slings and arrows compared to others. And I was mostly focused on the adversity side of the equation. I was doing a lot of research on the brain mechanisms that conferred vulnerability to anxiety and depression and other stress-related disorders. And the Dalai Lama asked me a very innocent question. He asked, why can't I use the same tools of modern science that I've been using to study depression and anxiety and fear and stress, and apply those tools to the study of kindness and to the study of compassion? And I didn't have a very good answer for him, other than that it's hard. But, it was hard when we first began to study anxiety and depression. And that was the wake-up call that really began this turning and eventually led to the development of the Center for Healthy Minds. And the Dalai Lama came out to inaugurate the center in 2010. And the mission of our center, as we publicly put it out there, is to cultivate well-being and relieve suffering through a scientific understanding of the mind. And since that first meeting I had with the Dalai Lama in 1992, it really has been a quite extraordinary journey. I think if you go back to textbooks of psychology and neuroscience in the early to mid 1990s, I doubt whether a single textbook would have the word compassion in its index. It was just not part of mainstream science. And I'm very thrilled to say today, it's a very different situation. And I would like to think that our work has played some part in nurturing interest in these areas.
No doubt, it for sure has. It is truly amazing that in 1992, all definitions, visions, understandings of mental health were absence of disease and pathology.
Yeah, absolutely. I often say when I went to graduate school, I was taught to look at people and to try to figure out what's wrong with them.
Yes.
And now I try to look at people and figure out what's right with them.
Exactly.
It's a really different orientation.
Absolutely different orientation. Well, thank you for your pioneering work in that. And not just naming that well-being, compassion, kindness, wholeness can be a goal, but developing actually a framework, a science around how people can bring about change in their lives to practice well-being and to enable well-being to be a dynamic skill, not just some status that we either have or don't have. Richie thinks of well-being as a skill, something to cultivate, something to practice, something you, yes, even you, can get really good at. It's an opening up this awareness of the possibility that you can approach thriving as a skill that I think is so transformative. He points out two kinds of learning that need to take place for us to access and exercise this thriving skill. One is declarative learning, the kind you get in school from reading, from listening to podcasts. And the other is procedural learning.
Yeah, so, that's something, it's a simple idea, but we think quite a radical idea that well-being actually is best regarded as a skill. And the science has led us to that inevitable conclusion. And it has led us to that because the core elements or constituents or pillars of well-being that we can get into in a moment, those constituents all are ones that we know are associated with particular networks in the brain, and those networks exhibit plasticity. They can change in response to experience and in response to training. And we now think of well-being in a way that is fundamentally no different than any other kind of skill. We know that one needs to practice in order to play a musical instrument. You can't learn to play the violin by simply reading books and attending lectures. It requires practice. And in the same way, we think of well-being and the constituents that comprise well-being. And this really invites an important reflection about the nature of two fundamentally different kinds of learning. And this is something we glean from modern neuroscience. One form of learning we call declarative learning, which is learning about stuff. So we can learn the value of kindness. And that's really important. It can teach us why kindness is important, the ways that it can be expressed, and so forth. But it doesn't necessarily make a person kinder. Another quality that may be even more stark in considering this is honesty. We can learn the value of honesty, but it's not going to necessarily make us a more honest person. So here there's a second form of learning, which is absolutely necessary, that we call procedural learning. Procedural learning is skill-based. It is acquired through practice, and it is instantiated in completely different brain networks than declarative learning. And both forms of learning are necessary for us to cultivate well-being. And in our culture, we know that declarative learning is privileged. In our schools of higher education, it's mostly declarative learning. And so here is where there really needs to be this complement. And it's also where the world's, I think, religious and spiritual traditions play such an important role, because they offer a kind of roadmap for the procedural learning that I think is critical and necessary to complement the declarative learning.
I want to help contextualize what these two types of learning are doing even here in this podcast. With and for is about integrating both of these kinds of learning. Declarative learning that presents insights and information, and procedural learning that facilitates an environment of practice in figuring out and working through. And I personally believe it's at this nexus of these two kinds of learning that we find our path towards spiritual health and thriving. And this is what Richie would call mental hygiene.
I often also use the analogy of brushing our teeth. When human beings first evolved on this planet, none of us were brushing our teeth. And somehow we've all managed to figure out how to do that for our own personal physical hygiene. And what we're talking about is something that is important for our personal mental hygiene. And I think most people would agree that their minds are even more important than their teeth.
And as our culture has changed or evolved or dissolved or however people's views might be on that, the frenetic pace that we live at, the bombardment of technology and stimuli, the potential for distraction has increased so much that this mental hygiene is really a necessary antidote to be intentional about cultivating strengths of mind, and is all the more important. Now, over many decades of research, Richie and his lab have come to describe 4 pillars of well-being that help us understand the dimensions of spiritual health and thriving. I asked him to walk through each of them for context before we dove in for a closer look. The 4 pillars are awareness, connection, insight, and purpose.
Yeah, so the 4 pillars of well-being evolved in an effort to identify the core constituents of well-being that also exhibit plasticity, that we know can change in response to experience and in response to training. And we wanted to identify pillars that have been scientifically examined, investigated in robust scientific research, and also pillars that have been identified in contemplative traditions as being important for the cultivation of human flourishing. And so we have arrived at 4 pillars. Now, we don't consider this, the end of the story. This is a preliminary roadmap subject to revision based on what we learn. But these 4 pillars as they currently exist are the following. The first is awareness. And awareness is about how we deploy our attention. It also involves self-awareness, and it involves a capacity that psychologists and neuroscientists call meta-awareness. Meta-awareness is the capacity to know what our minds are doing. Mm-hmm. The second pillar we call connection. And connection is about qualities that are important for healthy social relationships, qualities like appreciation and gratitude and kindness and compassion. All of those are part of the connection pillar. The third pillar is one we call insight. And insight is unusual. It's not present in any other framework for understanding well-being that we know of. Mm-hmm. But insight is about self-knowledge, and particularly knowledge of the narrative that we carry around about ourselves. All of us, every human being, has some kind of narrative, the story that we tell ourselves about who we are. Mm-hmm. And that's a necessary construct to help us navigate through the world. But if we overly identify with it, it can really place blinders on our ability to interact with the world. The insight pillar, the key to it is not so much changing the narrative, but it's changing our relationship to the narrative, mm-hmm. so that we can see the narrative for what it is. And just to give a little bit more example of this, we know that there are some people who have a very negative narrative. They have negative self-beliefs, they have low self-esteem, and they hold those beliefs to be a veridical description of who they are. And of course, that's a prescription for depression. And one of the key elements here is not so much having them initially change the narrative, but change their relationship to the narrative so that they can see that the narrative is really a constellation of thoughts, mm-hmm. that are fundamentally no different than other thoughts. And so the last pillar is purpose. And purpose is about finding our true sense of direction, our true north in life. And here it's, again, not so much about finding something more purposeful to do with our life, but how can we find meaning and purpose in that which we are already doing, including the pedestrian activities of daily life? Can washing the dishes and doing your laundry be connected to your sense of purpose? And the answer is, of course it could be. but it requires just a little bit of reframing. And so those are the 4 pillars.
Richie, thank you. Those are so helpful. As you said, these all relate to actual parts of our physical bodies, to our brain, our nervous system, that we know can be changed. And yet, from my vantage as one who, you were talking about insight and narrative, might understand my personal narrative as part of a larger narrative of the Christian narrative of how I understand God working in this world. These pillars can all influence how I engage with my own spiritual practices, whether they're for well-being or spiritual formation, however one might conceptualize that. So I'd love to take a little time and just ask you a few more questions about the pillars. And also, really importantly, I want to tell our audience that we will also be posting the Healthy Minds app. And the great news is that so much work has been done on this that you and your colleagues through Healthy Mind Innovations have developed a really extraordinary app that people can practice regularly and cultivate these skills of well-being and learn about awareness and connection and insight and purpose. If you are not familiar with that app, I really suggest that you all look into that. It has been really helpful in my own life and very transformative.
And for your listeners, just to add one other thing, the app is entirely free.
I mean, that is a generous gift to this world. And I know particularly adoption of it during COVID became more prominent in that for all of us struggling with anxiety and just trying to figure out how we pursued our purpose in quarantine, et cetera, that it was really helpful to break those down and to step by step strengthen our minds and so that we could pursue well-being. I wanted to jump in on the connection pillar. What does it mean to truly be with each other? To genuinely encounter the other in love and vulnerability and trust and gratitude. We know that relationships are incredibly powerful elements in our lives, whether we struggle with these or find them flowing and joyful. Well, okay, back to connection. So, especially within the Christian tradition, love, compassion, connection is so central. We often conceptualize an anthropology of being relational persons, and that relationality is so important. So I'd love to hear you speak a bit about what are some of the psychological capacities that get shaped in connection, and what are the types of practices that enable people to become more effective at connection with others?
Yeah, that's I love the lead-in and your reference to the importance of connection for the Christian faith. One of the things that I often say, and I'll say it here, is that humans are born to be kind. They're born to love. It is part of our nature. And what I mean by that is actually something based on science. That is, if we look at very young infants in the first 6 months of life, what we see is a preference for interactions that are loving, warm-hearted, compared to those that, for example, are selfish or aggressive. And here, the preference is not like 55% of infants prefer the pro-social, loving, warm-hearted encounter. It's like 100%. And so this is not a subtle preference. This is huge and robust. And this is something that's really important because it shows that when we nurture these qualities, we're not nurturing something de novo just out of nowhere, but rather we're actually nurturing a capacity that is part of the nature of who we are as human beings to begin with. And so the kind of practices that we have on the app can range from a practice that you can sprinkle through your everyday life that can take literally seconds. And one of them, for example, is appreciation. Appreciation is, I think, such a powerful and underappreciated quality. And it doesn't take much. But one of the things that we could do, for example, before we go into a meeting with our colleagues, we can think of something positive that they've done in the recent past and simply allow this natural sense of appreciation to emerge. If you've been working all day and you're about to go back to your family, you can spend a few moments reflecting and appreciating the family that you are blessed in having. Just these little moments of appreciation really help to nurture this kind of loving connection. Then there are other kinds of practices that are a little bit more elaborate, where, for example, we can bring a person into our mind and our heart, and we can reflect on a time in their life when they may have been having some difficulty, and we can cultivate the genuine aspiration that they be relieved of suffering, and we can send them our positive energy and love as we do that. And in this kind of practice, we typically begin with a loved one, where you have an uncomplicated, loving relationship with someone. It could be a family member, it could be a very close friend, it can even be a pet. And then you move on from there. You move on to others. One target that you can move on to is oneself. That often is more difficult than doing that for another. And then from there, we move typically to what is often called a neutral person. And what we mean by a neutral person is someone that we might recognize, but we don't know much about their life. It could be someone, for example, who works in the same building that you work in. It could be someone who takes a class that you take, whose face you recognize, but you don't really know much about their life. It could be someone in a grocery store who works in a grocery store that you frequent, a cashier. There are many people in, I think, everyone's life who would be this kind of category of a neutral person. And, recognizing that everyone faces challenges, bring them into your mind and heart, and just imagine a time in their life when they may have had some difficulty, and do the same thing. And then finally, we move on to a category that may be especially important, and that's what we call a difficult person. Someone who pushes your buttons, not necessarily starting with the most difficult person, but starting with someone who's challenging, and do the same thing with them. Bring them genuinely into your mind and your heart in an authentic way. And that's something that can really be an elixir for the soul.
And perhaps an antidote for polarization.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, I think that given the climate that we're living in our country today, it is so essential for a kind of recalibration, really necessary, I think, for us to regain our humanity.
In that spirit of integrating the intellectual declarative learning with embodied self-aware procedural learning, I asked Richie to guide us all through a meditative loving kindness practice that imaginatively asks us to call people to mind. Each of these people represents so many things, and taking moments to pay close attention to the feelings and thoughts that emerge reactively, as well as setting an intention for how we'd like to relate to these folks in keeping with our values. I find this an essential kind of practice for real transformation in my approach to connection and relationships. But I also find this to be a transformative approach to intercessory prayer, which is a central part of my own spiritual life and daily pattern of faith.
For those who are listening or viewing, perhaps close your eyes if that's something you feel comfortable doing. And if not, you can leave your eyes open with a soft gaze. And when we do this kind of procedural learning, we like to sit in a kind of upright and dignified posture, really to stay awake and to be present to the practice. And so let's find a posture that is upright, but not too tight, not too loose, something that's comfortable. And let's first begin with a moment of awareness, bringing our awareness into our bodies, into this moment. And one of the things that we like to emphasize whenever we begin a period of practice, however short it is to reflect for a few moments on our motivation. And let's see if we can find within us a place that it has an altruistic motivation for our practice, recognizing that calming our minds and opening our hearts is beneficial not only for ourselves, but is beneficial for all of those others that we touch in our lives, either directly or indirectly. And so let's spend a couple of moments simply reflecting on that. Now let's bring into our mind and our heart a person that is close to us, someone we know and love. And it could be, again, a family member, a close friend, or it can be an animal. And so bring that being into our mind and our heart. And let's spend a few moments reflecting on a period in that person's or that being's life that may have been difficult in whatever way. And as we breathe, on each in-breath, let's imagine that we are removing the difficulties. And on each out-breath, imagine that we are sending love to that person. As we breathe in, the difficulties begin to recede. And as we breathe out, we're extending our love and our wishes for that person to be happy and to be free of suffering. And as we end this very short period of practice, we always sandwich our procedural learning between two other components. We began with finding our motivation, and let's end with a dedication where we dedicate whatever insight, whatever benefit we may have gleaned from this very short period of practice. We dedicate it to the well-being and the welfare of others. And reflect on how we can bring a simple practice like this into our everyday lives in ways that can be beneficial to others. So let's open our eyes and return to the conversation.
Wow, what a gift. Thank you. To experience myself loving, feeling connected, actually changes my sense of self as a more connected and more loving and more generative person in the world, which I aim to be.
Totally.
But to have the practice of being that and to actively love a loved one is really powerful.
Yeah, and what I especially love about this is that for at least most people, it actually doesn't take that much
Right.
to sort of open our hearts. It really doesn't, because we're built to do that.
And I'll say, like, within my own tradition, we have a practice of intercessory prayer, where we, in our minds, pray for people, bring them before God, ask for healing or suffering to be removed or to get into college or the need du jour. But we don't tend to have the layers of setting intention, of opening ourselves to them and spending as much time. It almost is more like a laundry list of going through requests, where being deliberate about setting the intention, about calling them, holding them in your mind, and beholding them in front of God's presence, however you may conceptualize that, and breathing in their suffering and breathing out love to them is so powerful and is much more transformative than just a quick is better than nothing. But that for me really shows how we can expand and make even more transformative and vivifying our common prayers.
Yeah, that's great. I love that.
We moved on to explore the pillars of awareness and insight. There are fascinating studies on self-regarding feelings, how we feel about ourselves. Particularly helpful are studies of depression, which contribute to Richie's understanding of a healthy self-concept. These feelings about ourselves are such intimate, automatic things. They are part of what Richie calls a default network, that we don't even realize that there is a narrative forming out of these feelings that each of us tells to ourselves about ourselves. Take a moment and think as we jump back in with Richie. What's the narrative or the story you tell yourself about yourself?
Yeah, so the two pillars that are novel in our framework are awareness and insight. Connection and purpose you find in many other frameworks for understanding well-being, but awareness and insight are pretty unique. And there's a lot of both science as well as contemplative wisdom which has informed this. On the science side, a lot of this has come from research on depression and on the narratives that depressed people tell themselves, and also from cognitive therapy and derivatives of cognitive therapy that have specifically worked with narratives to both alter a person's relationship to those narratives and ultimately to change the narratives themselves. But it is from research on depression that we know how powerful a narrative can be in shaping a person's demeanor, their mood, and even really basic elements of their perception. It's deep. It's quite amazing to see how pervasive the impacts really can be. They are really significant. And, a person, if we really attend to the language that they might use, that they might say something like, I am sad or I am depressed. And we can ask ourselves, well, what does that mean? I am sad. Does that mean that all of you is sad? Is every sort of morsel in your body sad? What does it mean to actually say something like that? And when we begin to ask those kind of questions, we begin to penetrate the shell of a self. We begin to find holes, if you will, and we begin to see that it may be a little bit more permeable than we might have initially expected. A person may say, well, maybe there is a small piece of me that's not sad and the rest of me is. Well, and we can then begin to ask, well, what exactly is this entity that we call ourselves? Another case where this is really powerful is pain. We can say, I'm in pain. Well, what does that mean? And again, is all of you in pain? Is all of me in pain? And asking that question begins to break it up. You can see that it is not nearly as homogeneous and as fixed as we might otherwise have thought. And so the science basically shows us that this narrative that we carry around acts as a filter. And literally, the world that we interact with, it's in part influenced by, quote, what's out there, but actually we're not seeing what's out there. We're seeing our construction of what's out there. And our construction of what's out there is filtered through this narrative. And so we can ask ourselves, well, what if we had a different narrative? How would it be? And how might we experience this particular situation? And that can really be powerful in helping to loosen the grip of the narrative. So the narrative is something important. We need the narrative. It's not, a human being cannot, it would be maladaptive to get rid of a narrative. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But we need to have a healthy relationship to the narrative. We need to understand deeply in an experiential way what this narrative is, what function it can serve, and how to let go of it at the right time.
Mm-hmm. So having that meta-awareness to be able to understand that I am not all one thing. Even if I'm in pain, it's not all encompassing. Or if I have a feeling, an emotion, or a narrative, it doesn't completely define me. And I actually can have control over what I tell myself.
Absolutely. And even, a lot of people, I think, don't even recognize that they have a narrative.
Yeah, right.
And that the narrative is actually powerfully guiding their behavior and experience in the world.
But I think we're in a beautiful moment where we can enable young people, older people, or any persons to have a lens for understanding like, no, you have a narrative. These are components of it. And what is the beyond the self component of it? Where are those sources of meaning? And then what becomes the motivation sources within your narrative? So I think there's a wonderful opportunity.
Yeah, no, I think that's extremely well put. And it is such an important moment in our nation's history because traditional religious narratives are less available. And also the kind of national narrative of what it means to live in America in a democracy is, kind of up for grabs. It's not nearly as coherent as it once was.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I really like the work of Mary Helen Immordino Yang on meaning making, talking about the default mode network, which is, been really integral for us, for a species, to be able to react to anxiety and fear. And I think as humans initially, that was prominent. We didn't need meaning to go towards something. Our survival was based on staying alive. We needed fear and anxiety. But as we are less in what I would call a surviving-oriented culture and moving towards an era where we need narratives, we need meaning to have priorities, to discover purpose, to be able to regulate our goals and our time. And I would understand that is more of an area where we are more apt to thrive when we have that meaning than survive. That her work showing that the default mode network can intentionally be kind of repurposed or co-opted around meaning making. So it's not just left to ruminate around fear and anxiety, is quite fascinating to me.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it's wonderful work. The default mode or the default network is a network of brain regions that are active when we're not doing other cognitively demanding tasks. And so if a person were simply given the ambiguous instruction to please simply rest, what most people would do is activate their default network. And the default network has sometimes been associated with mind wandering, with rumination. But what it almost always is associated with is something that is self-referential. It is about ourselves. One of the things that we and others have found with contemplative training is that it's not so much that the default network gets put offline or suppressed in some way, but that the way the default network is connected to other networks in the brain changes. So it's the connectivity between the default network and other networks that really can change. And in that way, it can be harnessed in the way that you're describing. It can be a source of meaning making rather than a source of rumination and distraction.
Well, that's really powerful from my perspective. Because I think like surviving is so much based on being driven by fear and anxiety, where thriving would be being purposeful towards love. And so that you're growing towards something as opposed to being reactive. It's a more proactive and generating meaningful narratives that are based on sources of love and generativity. Again, I asked Richie to guide us through a practice for awareness and insight. I invite you to integrate some of these ideas with a procedural practice for the sake of insight into your own motivations, stories about yourselves, and your core identity.
So let's do a little bit of practice here. So again, let's close our eyes for those who are comfortable doing this. If not, we can leave our eyes open and with a soft gaze. And again, finding our posture, taking a moment to check in with our body. And again, also being very intentional about our motivation. And again, seeing if we can find this place within us that recognizes that practices to cultivate our own well-being are beneficial not only for ourselves, but for others. And in this sense, really is a radical act of generosity. And now for insight, let's bring into our mind a situation that has been challenging in some way in the recent past. It could be an issue in our work. It could be with our family. Not too difficult, but some challenging issue. And let's spend a moment to identify whatever this issue is for ourselves. And now let's reflect on our own beliefs and expectations about that situation. What beliefs and what expectations are we bringing to that situation? And now let's see if we can envision how things might be different if we came to this situation with a different set of beliefs and expectations. Can you envision the situation being somehow different? If we came at it with a very different set of beliefs and expectations. And now we'll end this very short period of practice. And again, before we end, let us dedicate whatever benefit, whatever insight we may have gleaned from even this very short period of practice, and dedicate it to the benefit of others. We can now open our eyes and re-engage.
Super wonderful to have the moment to reframe, might be an undersimplifying the process, but to gain new perspective on something that's hard. And really wonderful to experience how something that I might view as a problem or an obstacle or a challenge, just the reflecting on it, then I can then offer the insight I gain as a gift for something beyond me.
Yeah, totally.
The final pillar, purpose, is incredibly important to me. I see purpose as our telos. That's the Greek word for end, goal, the point of it all. I see purpose as fundamentally tied to our sense of meaning in life, and therefore a fundamental component of spiritual and mental health.
Yeah, I mean, the fourth pillar is really fundamentally about transcendent values. And what we mean by that is something that goes beyond oneself, a purpose that goes beyond oneself. I mean, it could be simply family, community, in a religious context. It could be God, but it's something that goes beyond oneself. It could be to just one other person. But when we can take a simple daily activity and reframe it so that we recognize that we're doing it not only for ourselves, but we're doing it for others, it really can be transformative. So just to give one, super pedestrian, concrete example of this, in the height of COVID, we were all homebound, at least much more than we usually are for most people. I was doing the chores of daily living much more consistently. And we have a cat at home, and I was the one who would scoop the litter every night. And, when I did it, I actually accompanied it with just a short little practice that I'm scooping the litter, not just, for the cat, but I'm scooping it for my wife, for any other person who enters so that they wouldn't have to smell it. It was just a good thing to be doing. And I did it with a lot of joy. It gave me a sense of vitality. And, it's just a simple example of how something that we do on a daily basis can be reframed to connect with a sense of purpose that goes beyond oneself. And it can completely change your relationship to that activity.
Absolutely. I think in the Western world, we're very goal-driven. And often we can have the eyes on the prize or the eyes on the horizon, which I think it's great to have an eye on the horizon, but losing the purpose of the present moment, that it is a means towards a greater end, a means towards loving others is hard to do, but so important. Something I'm very mindful for. This all involves slowing down to understand the meaning or purpose of daily actions.
Yeah, that's great. That's great. And I think we can use everyday activities and develop simple little rituals around them, like eating. Everyone eats, typically several times a day. And it's a moment to express our appreciation to, it takes a village to get food on the table. And when you reflect on how many different people it actually took to enable you to eat and have some sense of appreciation for that. I mean, everyday life is replete with those moments if we just wake up to them.
Richie, I'd love to ask you about the skills of well-being. One is, are there any downsides, or have you seen them twisted or taken in a wrong way? What are perversions or twisted notions of some of these practices that you're aware of?
Yeah, I think there are many minefields with this, many. One of them is sort of blaming the victim. And so we say that well-being is a skill, but we also know that horrific conditions really can impact your well-being. Extreme poverty takes a toll on one's well-being, and it's not so simple to cultivate skills of well-being in the face of those kinds of adversities. And so I think that we need to be extremely sensitive to that and to be very careful about not blaming the victim. Another big pitfall is there's a lot of hype about mindfulness in our culture, and in my view, perhaps too much emphasis on mindfulness. We can generalize that, and by saying that too much emphasis on any one pillar to the exclusion of others is probably not healthy. We need all of them. I often use the analogy of going to the gym and just working out on your upper body. That would be the equivalent of just cultivating mindfulness. If that's all you're doing, it would be useful for certain things, but ultimately lead to some imbalance. And so we need all of them. And finally, I think it's really important to underscore the fact that one size does not fit all. People often ask me, well, what's the best kind of meditation to do? And I'll say, I'll tell you what the best is. The best form of meditation is the form of meditation that you actually do. That's more important than the specifics. Yeah, doing something that is regular, that you're committed to, that is something you can sustain.
I've often wondered about a strange gap in psychology and neuroscience. Love and compassion are not popular research subjects. Why is that? They're core, elemental, and definitive of human life and thriving. I close my conversation with Richie on a loving note. We need to understand love and compassion so much more. I know love means many different things. Scientists slice and dice it differently. It's a hard concept from philosophy to theology to get a hold of. But one of the ways I understand thriving is that, as you were saying, as humans, we're relational. I'd love to hear you speak how these pillars might enable people to both experience and offer love more fully, if that resonates with you at all.
Yeah, it totally resonates. And, I'm really so appreciative that you brought up love. In the scientific arena, at least the one in which I operate, love is still, at least to a large extent, a taboo topic. And I would liken love to what compassion was 25 years ago. And I've actually, it's so interesting that you brought this up in this way, Pam. I've been intentionally using the word love more and more in public talks, because I think it is going to be the next, major issue that science needs to embrace. I believe that all four pillars of well-being contribute to both our capacity to receive as well as our capacity to express love. The current Surgeon General of the United States is someone that I've come to know quite well. I consider him a good friend, Vivek Murthy, and he has framed the current predicament in which we're living in our country today as an epic struggle between the forces of love and the forces of fear. And I think it is something really important about this. And love, I think, is the antidote to fear. We're all participants in this grand experiment for which none of us have given our informed consent, which is exposure to all the media that we're all, barraged with. And a lot of that are messages of fear. And I think that for us to recalibrate in the way we need to recalibrate, it's really the most important antidote is love. I think that this is something that's more important than anything else. And I think that we need to name it, and we need to call as much attention to it as we can, and to disseminate practical strategies for tapping into this quality, which I would consider to be something innate that every human being has the capacity for.
Well, I want to ask you a big question. This is something I think a lot about, and that's, what is thriving to you?
From my perspective, I would say thriving is nurturing all of the innate capacities that we've been given. And here, the 4 pillars of well-being in our framework are critical: awareness, connection, insight, and purpose. And I think when we are expressing these qualities to their maximum, we are thriving by definition. And I would say perhaps the most important manifestation of that is our capacity to both receive and to express love.
Richie, this has been extraordinary. Thank you for being present and offering yourself, your expertise, your wisdom so generously.
And thank you, Pam, for all that you're doing and for who you are and what you're bringing to the world. My life has been enriched by having you as a friend and a colleague, so I really appreciate that.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much, Richie.
Very good.
I'm grateful for Richie Davidson's integrated approach to spiritual health and mental well-being. He makes the neuroscience of spirituality so accessible and tangible. And though we'll always encounter obstacles and trials on this journey towards spiritual health and thriving, Richie invites us into an accessible act of meditative attention, which in some ways is so simple. It is so powerful, but it's not easy, and it requires making it a habit. The key takeaways that I will carry with me from this conversation are the following. We have a robust and glorious agency to cultivate our personal well-being, which emerges from a deep understanding of the mind that is connected to practical wisdom and exercising our mental hygiene. Transformation comes from the integration of declarative and procedural learning. We make progress when we connect scientific and spiritual truths with habitual practice and showing up daily. Connection and relational encounters are essential in human life, and so much of our felt absence of well-being hinges on relational struggles. But we have the power to shift our relational experiences to more loving places that align with our deepest values. For many, the stories we tell about ourselves are incredibly severe and harmful. To cultivate self-compassion and our self-awareness, we need to carefully identify those stories and align them to our purpose and deepest values. Discerning and articulating your purpose will keep you grounded and directed in your journey towards spiritual health. And finally, in the words of 1 John 4:18, perfect love casts out fear. With and For is a production of the Thrive Center at Fuller Theological Seminary. This episode featured Richie Davidson, with very special thanks to Nikki Feit and the staff of the Center for Healthy Minds. This season, new episodes drop every Monday. For more information, visit our website, thethrivecenter.org, where you'll find all sorts of resources to support your pursuit of wholeness and a life of thriving on purpose. I am so grateful to the staff and fellows of the Thrive Center and our With and For podcast team. Jill Westbrook is our senior director and producer. Lauren Kim is our operations manager. Ren Jurgensen is our social media graphic designer. Evan Rosa is our consulting producer. And special thanks to the team at Fuller Studio and the Fuller School of Psychology and Marriage and Family Therapy. I'm your host, Dr. Pam King. Thank you for listening.